Hello viewers, this is Angela Moorjani from Kasturba Gandhi College in Hyderabad, and today we are going to begin to do a poem with the most strange of names. It's by an American poet called E. Cummings, and it's called When Serpents Bargain for a Right to Squirm. Edward Cummings was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1894 to very liberal parents who gave him all the support he needed to develop the creative arts and the gifts that were within him. After an education at Harvard and a brief stint at a regular job, the rest of Cummings' life was spent in pursuing his gifts of writing poetry and painting. His vast body of work includes 2,900 poems, 2 autobiographical novels, 4 plays, and several essays, drawings, and paintings. Cummings developed his own unique style of language, giving it a gleeful and an ironic twist which distinguishes it from that of every other writer. He is known for his orthography or style of writing being completely untraditional and unconventional. Cummings is known to have mixed words up and combined them in impossible ways, sometimes employing nouns to work as verbs and verbs as nouns. Even in the area of punctuation and capitalization, Cummings made his own rules. Most of the time, his work is in lowercase, and capitals were reserved only when he wanted to give a special emphasis to something. Cummings held that the day of the traditional lyric was way past, and those of the conventional images too. And he believed very firmly that the time had now come for the poet to build three-dimensionally, but with a great deal of subtlety, into the consciousness of the reader or the one that would experience his poem. Cummings was a combination of an unabashed romantic in his views of life and an avant-garde modernist, one who was constantly searching for new and unique ways of self-expression as an artist. He is considered to be the preeminent voice of poetry in an age in which there were other outstanding American writers like Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, and William Faulkner. The poem, When Serpents Bargain for the Right to Squirm, is a perfect example of an English sonnet. It is a 14-line poem divided into 3 quatrains followed by a concluding couplet. Just as in the traditional sonnet pattern, the 3 quatrains each have 4 lines and have the rhyme scheme A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, and E-F. And these represent different views of the main theme that the poet has taken as his topic of study in the poem. The conclusion of the poet is encapsulated in the concluding couplet, which has the rhyme scheme G-G. The 3 quatrains have different situations which the poet represents as whens, or in other words, when this happens, or when that happens, or when a third thing happens. And in the concluding couplet, the poet begins with then. And he seems to say that then, when those whens happen, he will change his mind and adopt a different perspective about human beings. When you read those quatrains, you will find out that all the whens which are mentioned by the poet are almost impossible to happen. There is no likelihood of those things ever happening. So we can surmise that the then which the poet promises in the concluding couplet will also likewise most likely never occur. The message of the poem seems to be this: The poet is saying that when the poet begins to observe certain things in nature which he mentions in the first 3 quatrains, which are all highly ridiculous situations and we know that they will never happen, then the poet says in the conclusion, will he be convinced that man is indeed the most superior creature in this universe. And not until then, the poet reiterates, can anybody convince him otherwise? That means that until he sees man behaving at least equal to animals or better than animals, he cannot be convinced that man is unanimal, as he says in that poem. And therefore what the poet is trying to say is that human beings are demonstrating qualities and behaviors that are far inferior to those of animals, yet in spite of that, human beings consider themselves to be superior to animals. To the poet, this is an absurd and preposterous claim, and the poet says that he will refuse to believe such a claim just by looking at nature. Have you ever observed nature? Do the planets ever leave the course of their orbits? Do flowers not bloom in their correct season? Does the rain ever go up instead of down, breaking the law of gravity? Yet you will find many times human beings break the laws. Human beings don't do what they're supposed to do. Human beings don't follow the rules and the instructions. In spite of all this, they don't even consider their behavior to be below the mark or strange in any way. Yet human beings do stake a claim to being the best creature on this planet Earth. And that's what the poet finds really absurd. The poem is full of literary devices. The poet makes use of several personifications, alliterations, assonance, and these are all interwoven into the message of the poem. For more details of these literary devices, you can refer to the notes. The end result is that Cummings has created a beautiful lyric poem, but it's not just that, it has a value in the ironic and satirical message that is encompassed within it. Like all of his other poems, this poem too is rife with satire. The poem incorporates Cummings' trademark usage of lowercase letters. The entire poem is in the lowercase and it is marked by the complete absence of punctuation. Have you ever noticed that all things in nature run so smoothly, almost as if they were on autopilot? Nature doesn't have to be prodded. Nature doesn't have to be watched in order that it will perform its duties. Nature doesn't have to be threatened for it to do the things that it's supposed to do. Everything happens perfectly, just on time, according to the way in which it was ordained to happen. But this is not the case with man. Man needs to be watched. Man needs to be reminded. Man needs to be prodded. And yes, there are times when man even needs to be threatened just so that he will do his daily, everyday work. This poem is an attack on human pride, and it shows man up poorly in the light against the animal kingdom and the kingdom of vegetation, because compared to animals and plants, men seldom do what they are meant to do, yet at the same time they consider themselves superior to both of these kingdoms as well as the celestial kingdom up there. Here's the poem, the text of the poem, When Serpents Bargain for the Right to Squirm by E. Cummings. When serpents bargain for the right to squirm, and the sun strikes to gain a living wage, when thorns regard their roses with alarm, and rainbows are insured against old age, when every thrush may sing no new moon in, if all screech owls have not okayed his voice, and any wave signs on the dotted line, or else an ocean is compelled to close. When the oak begs permission of the birch to make an acorn, valleys accuse their mountains of having altitude, and March denounces April as a saboteur, then we'll believe in that incredible unanimal mankind. and not until. To gain an understanding of this unconventional poem, we'll have to look at it a little differently than we've done other poems. So we will look at the concluding couplet first. The couplet says, "Then we'll believe in that incredible unanimal mankind and not until." The couplet begins with an apparently distant then, and the mocking tone of the poet does not escape our attention. The poet seems to say that this then will most likely never happen because he does not expect human behavior to change at all, neither in the present nor even in the distant future. Man is constantly seen to be setting himself above and apart from other kingdoms like the animal kingdom and the kingdom of plants on the basis of two things, his intelligence and his ability to reason. Man thinks that he is superior to all other creatures just because he is a rational being. However, in these lines, the poet seems to say that in spite of his intelligence and in spite of being a rational being, human beings do things which nature would never be found to be guilty of. In spite of the lesser intelligence of animals and in spite of the condition of plants, they would never dream of certain kinds of behaviors that human beings are guilty of, and human beings do it all the time without even thinking there's anything wrong with it. And this kind of behavior Cummings finds absurd and unthinkable. How can a creature who behaves worse than the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom consider himself to be superior to those very kingdoms? This is the question that he is putting to us through the poem that we are studying today. The poet's use of the personal pronoun we is also extremely important. What he seems to say is, if somebody were boasting to you and saying, "Oh, I can easily bash up Undertaker from WWE," and then you respond and say, "Oh, really? We'll see." You know, that mocking tone which is obvious in that statement, that's the kind of we which the poet is using in this particular sentence. Using we also helps the poet in another way. We know that somehow the poet has lost all faith in mankind and he really wishes to denounce the whole of mankind through this poem. But in using we, he includes himself in that category of people whom he is criticizing, and somehow it makes the tone of the poem less harsh by his use of we because it includes himself. So what he's really trying to say is that all of us human beings are the same. I'm like you too. It's not only you who considers yourself superior in a wrong way, in an unjustifiable way, but I'm guilty of the same transgression. And so in including himself, the poet lightens the tone of the poem and makes the whole poem more credible. He makes the whole criticism more plausible, more believable, and more real. Through all of this, Cummings wishes to show us how pretentious and how ridiculous many of man's claims to superiority are, and how much without any justification at all. The use of the word incredible as it comes just before man is also highly ironic, because although it seems like what the poet is saying is that man is incredible, what he's actually saying is that it is incredible or unbelievable that man, knowing all the things that he has done, can ever think himself to be a superior being. So it's a highly ironic statement that has been made by Cummings in this couplet. So the poet is trying to tell us that until he sees such changes take place in human behavior, or if he sees changes take place in the animal and plant kingdom, he will not believe that man is anything more than an animal or unanimal, because the poet is convinced that at heart man is really only an animal. And that's what he's trying to tell us through this whole poem. Many animal lovers will agree with this hypothesis. There are people who love dogs and who claim that loving a dog is more gratifying than loving a human being. Dogs are so faithful, so loving, they never give up on their master, whereas many human beings will often give up on their children, on their parents, and yes, even on their spouses. Stanza 1 describes 4 impossible scenarios of 4 whens. The first of these is when serpents begin to bargain for a right to squirm. Why would serpents ever need to negotiate concerning something that comes naturally to them? That's what serpents do. Serpents wriggle and serpents writhe on the ground. Why would serpents ever need to convince other people to allow them to squirm? This is a hypothetical situation which can never be. It's an impossibility. There's never a day, likewise, that the sun fails to shine in the morning. Any morning that you wake up, you can be sure that the sun will also rise on that day. You can stake your very life on it. In fact, in most cultures, the rising of the sun is an image of loyalty and faithfulness, because we know that no matter what, the sun must rise. So the poet asks the question, he's wondering, what if the sun went on a strike for new wages? What if the sun didn't show up to work one morning and said that what he wanted was a higher salary? We know that this would never happen because nature does not indulge in those kind of things which are common to human beings. Nature is dependable to the last. Nature is so faithful, and that's the difference between nature and man that the poet is bringing out in this stanza. Next, the poet asks, what if thorns looked with shock upon the roses on a bush? We know this would never happen. If anyone should look with shock, it should be the beautiful flowers and not the thorns. Yet, the roses and the thorns accept each other as legitimate parts of a rose bush. Neither one wants to see the other removed from its path. They learn to coexist happily on that plant, but not so human beings. Many times, the thorns of life want to see the roses done away with. Take, for instance, people like Mahatma Gandhi, people like Abraham Lincoln, the beautiful flowers of our nations that were taken out by the thorns because they couldn't stand for them to be on this same planet. Nature is so remarkably superior to human beings if you look at it in such detail. Another impossibility that the poet brings up is rainbows getting insurance against old age. Now, we know that rainbows have been around for a long time. Yet, have you ever seen a rainbow that's tired of coming across the sky? Have you ever seen a rainbow displaying the signs of aging? Never. Every rainbow looks beautiful and fresh. Rainbows don't get concerned about the future. We don't know of any rainbow that has taken out a policy that it would be bright and beautiful for the next 500 years. Yet human beings are constantly worried about the future. They take out policies, they make all kinds of arrangements for 40 years, 50 years down the line and forget the joy and the beauty of the moment that they are in. The poet seems to suggest that if we just shine our brightest in this moment, we need not worry about insurance for the future. What we have to do is learn from nature that it's all about the present. If we live our lives to the fullest in this moment, in the present, the future will take care of itself. In stanza 2, Cummings describes another set of situations in which one aspect of nature is dependent upon the other for approval. In other words, one can hold the other to ransom. He says here that thrushes normally sing at the onset of a new moon. However, he says, What would it be like if thrushes needed to get the permission of the screech owl before it could sing a song? We know that this is an impossible situation, because in the perfectly and clearly charted roles that nature gives to each creature, a screech owl will screech and a thrush will sing, and the roles of the two will never get mixed up, and one will never be dependent upon the other or hold the other to ransom, unlike what we see happening many times in the course of human relationships. As ludicrous as that situation appeared to be, Cummings goes on to describe yet another ridiculous situation in which, unless waves agree to sign on the dotted line, oceans might have to close down. In other words, oceans and waves would have to enter into a legally binding agreement wherein the waves would constantly bring water into the oceans so that the oceans would never get emptied. Now, as absurd and ridiculous as this seems, again, the whole point of drawing this situation out before us is Cummings' desire for us to see that as human beings, we very often behave in this fashion. Instead of performing the functions that are duly accorded to us, we don't do them until we are forced to sign on the dotted line. We fail to do the things that we are meant to do, we are ordained to do, unless we are held to those things by a legally binding agreement. Human beings are so easy to divert. Human beings go away from the path and direction that they're meant to be on at the drop of a hat. So they have to be controlled. They have to be held in by legally binding agreements. Look at the waves, he seems to say. Look at the oceans, he tells us. They just perform what they have to. Nobody's watching over them. They are not under anyone's jurisdiction, and yet things just go on perfectly for them, because that's how nature operates. In stanza 3, Cummings describes yet another situation wherein trees and valleys begin to behave like human beings. Like human beings, they are jealous, intolerant, and in general will do everything they can to prevent each other from doing the work that they are supposed to do naturally. And so in this instance, he talks about an oak tree which very naturally produces acorns. But this oak tree, he says, needs to get the permission of a birch tree which belongs to the same family. So it's kind of like getting your cousin's permission to do something. And this oak tree cannot produce an acorn unless the birch gives it permission. Now that's nonsense, you might be saying. No oak tree would need to get permission from any birch. Yet, how many times have you seen one human being tampering with the work style of another, preventing another from doing what he's supposed to do, stopping other people who work well from doing the right thing? Many, many times. We human beings are guilty of such things all the time. Then Cummings asks, what if a valley turned around and accused the mountain of being too tall? Now that is hilarious, because the taller the mountain is, the deeper the valley would be. The existence of one predetermines the existence of the other. No mountain, then no valley. Yet, many times we human beings don't consider and we accuse other people of doing wrong things, not realizing that their existence is what makes our existence possible in the first place. Another ridiculous hypothetical situation would become a reality if March accused April of stomping on its domain. As in, when April arrives, then March must end. But March never accuses April of being a saboteur. This is understood that the domain of March ends here and the domain of April begins there. Such rivalry never exists in nature, yet we see such rivalry manifest itself again and again in the case of human beings. Even though the poem When Serpents Bargain for a Right to Squirm was written many decades ago, we can see that it foreshadows an imminent problem that mankind is facing today. Man's indiscriminate felling of trees and his unabated exploitation of fossil fuels is leading this planet on a pathway to destruction. If man does not quickly align himself with nature, it looks like we may not stand even a fighting chance of survival on this planet. It's precisely because of man's poor management of his natural resources that man finds himself today in a predicament where he has to take some strategic decisions to change his behaviors. Otherwise, life is going to be very different and very difficult on this planet. Scientists tell us that global warming has increased in the last 10 years and brought the average worldwide temperature up by approximately 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit all over the world. Now, this could have many other cascading ill effects like flooding in low-lying areas, extinction of certain species, and a general warming up of temperatures worldwide, in addition to unseasonal rainfall and droughts, volcanoes, and other things that are happening all over the world. Now, if you look at it, nature is not to blame for any of this. Nature has been functioning properly and in accord with its preordained paths. It's only man who has broken that deviated path, and it's about time now that man did something in order to decrease the dangers to himself that might come if he continues on this pathway of destruction. In this poem, Cummings expresses his fear that man is on a downward spiral, and the worst bit of this tragedy is that he doesn't even know it. He doesn't even recognize what he's doing wrong. Cummings dramatizes this by showing us what it would be like if nature took on certain characteristics of human beings and exhibited human emotions. What if nature became jealous? What if nature became intolerant? What if nature tried to sabotage other aspects of nature? What would happen then? In the alarm that we feel and the absurdity that we feel is the key to Cummings's answer. So long as we recognize that the behaviors that we have been demonstrating are so not good for us, they are so harmful to us, we will in turn make a decision to turn around and change those behaviors that we might align with nature in a general way that will be profitable for all of mankind. When these behaviors appear preposterous and absurd in nature, it is equally preposterous and absurd for man who exhibits such behaviors every day and thinks nothing of it to consider himself to be the most superior creature in all of creation. We are the actual animals that we depreciate, and not unless we turn things over, not until we turn everything upside down, can we truly claim that we have become unanimal or human.